Uh, yeah, just to say thanks very much indeed for this opportunity and to present this paper, Future Outlook for UK Farming. Although thinking about events in the last 24 hours even, I'd say it's a slightly risky task, given that we still exist on shifting sands, both in terms of our future relationship with other countries and the future domestic farm policy in the UK. Having said that, we did have our own Farmers Weekly webinar just a few weeks ago entitled, What Does the Future of Farming Look Like? And having chaired and written that up for the magazine, I'm hopefully fairly up to speed with what's going on. I should also say at the start that I'm really going to focus on the UK. My knowledge of agriculture on the island of Jersey is pretty much limited to a 10-minute briefing discussion on potatoes with Peter Lemestre before the event, and another 10 minutes with Andrew Legale on dairying, both of whom are extremely helpful, but I'm sure just scratch the surface. So where are we now and where are we going? I think I'll start with a little look back at the year we've just had. And there's no doubt that the farming sector in the UK is coming to the end of one of the most challenging years in living memory, although we do seem to say that rather a lot these days. I think we said the same this time last year, in fact. Farmers Weekly, we're currently conducting a survey of readers for a feature in our Christmas issue. And one of the questions that we've asked was, what has been the greatest challenge you've faced in 2020? And the option that we've given our readers was coronavirus, market conditions, labour supply, extreme weather, rural crime, mental health, pests, disease, government policy. The list goes on. It's a long list of challenges. But without wishing to preempt the survey, I don't doubt that we'll find that COVID-19 and government policy rank high among those top challenges, together with the weather, of course. On coronavirus, it was actually a pretty mixed picture, I'd say. There was considerable market disruption in the early stages of lockdown, with breeding sheep and cattle sales suspended. Some milk producers hit really hard by the closure of the food service sector, lamb prices tumbling. And farmers with agritourism and events diversifications were also hit hard in the early stages, though some benefited from a surge in business over the summer, as many people opted for so-called staycations. Other farmers made good by selling more direct to the public. There were also issues with increased pressure on the countryside, as the general public rediscovered the countryside, venturing out into rural areas. But that came with the attendant problems of sheep worrying, littering, fly tipping, rural crime. Also, the list of cancelled shows and events had an effect, particularly on farmers' mental health in some circumstances, as farmers were unable to get to the events that they would normally attend during the course of the year. But despite all these problems, I'd say that the food and farming sectors probably fared better than many other during the pandemic. After all, everybody still has to eat. Turning now to farm policy, I don't doubt that many of you have been following the passage of the Agriculture Bill, which will set the framework for farm support in the UK in the years to come. The bill was actually brought back in January following Boris Johnson's victory in the general election, and it contained a number of improvements from its earlier version, such as a commitment to review food security every 5 years, and a determination to improve farmers' return from the marketplace, and even the possibility of market intervention in the event of some unforeseen market crisis. But the bill also set out the timetable for phasing out direct payments to farmers, starting as soon as next year, with cuts of 5% for the first £30,000, climbing to 25% cuts on payments over 150 grand. And these cuts will continue through to 2027, when the basic payment scheme will cease altogether. I know obviously that Jersey farmers don't have anything like the same level of support as UK farmers, but I'm sure you can all imagine the deep concern that exists when the basic payment accounts for about 60% of farm profit across farms in the UK. It's some consolation, I guess, that the total sum of taxpayer money for the sector is expected to remain the same for the life of the current Parliament. But after that, it's anybody's guess, although it's fairly safe to assume that sums will go down rather than up. We also know from the Agriculture Bill that payments will be delinked from a need to produce food, and there'll also be an opportunity to farmers to take their payments as a lump sum at the start of the 7-year transition period. That money could be used as an outgoes payment to get out of farming, or to invest in the farm, or even to fund diversification. The other key element in all this is the government's plans to introduce its public money for public goods approach, primarily through the development of its Environmental Land Management Scheme, or ELMS. And this will reward farmers for helping to deliver things like clean air, reduced pollution, thriving wildlife, better landscapes, and even measures to mitigate climate change. Further details on ELMS are expected later this month. Based on a discussion document that was published earlier this year, we do know that the government is planning a 3-tier approach, with a base level for farmers to encourage environmentally friendly farming, rising to a 3rd tier, which will be for more landscape scale projects like forest creation and peat restoration. A national pilot scheme for ELMS is due to launch next year, and the full scheme is expected to be up and running from late 2024. It's not all about ELMS, of course. The animal health and welfare pathway is another important element of this public money for public goods strategy that could see farmers paid for doing things like cutting stocking rates in chickens or improving lameness in cattle. And DEFRA is also planning a series of productivity grants to help farmers invest in equipment and technology. I should also add at this stage that much of what I've been saying just relates to England and English farming. Devolution adds another layer of complexity, although in general terms I'd say that the administrations in Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast are looking to retain direct payments a little bit longer to keep some farmers going in more challenging areas. But there is going to be a move towards the environmental agenda as well. That's definitely on the way in devolved regions too. Hopefully the slide has changed. And the other thing that I'd like to talk about is obviously the trade impact of Brexit, both within the EU and with the rest of the world. And you'll no doubt be familiar with the political ping pong that's going on between the House of Commons and the House of Lords over the Agriculture Bill, with the Lords keen to include a clause to make it illegal to import food which doesn't match up to UK food standards as part of any future free trade deals, while the government is adamant that this is actually unnecessary. Last night, actually, the House of Lords voted in favour of a new amendment from George Eustace, which would give MPs a bit more scrutiny on future trade deals. But again, they rejected any notion of banning imports outright if they do not match UK standards. To my mind, that's disappointing because so many people obviously care about the quality of their food. Indeed, over 2.5 million people have now signed various petitions saying that they want such protection, and yet the government still refuses to enshrine it in primary legislation. Yes, ministers have said frequently that they'll maintain high standards on imports, but ministers say lots of things and then fail to deliver. So what are the prospects for trade deals? We're still waiting to hear the outcome of negotiations between the UK and Brussels on future arrangements for trade with the European Union. In the middle of October, it seemed that a no deal was the inevitable outcome, with Boris Johnson saying the talks are off and we must prepare for WTO terms of trade. Yet less than a week later, talks are back on, and they still are, just about, with fisheries and state aids the main sticking points, as the UK seeks to maintain tariff-free access to the European Union while exercising as much self-determination as possible. The issue of Northern Ireland, though not talked about quite so much in recent weeks, must also be a sticking point, I'm sure. But it's very clear that avoiding a no deal is in everyone's interests. The sheep sector in the UK would be absolutely decimated if it had to pay tariffs of 46% on its exports, as would parts of the beef sector. But having said that, as a net importer, prospects for the dairy sector may not be quite so terrifying, as the imposition of tariffs could actually drive up prices in the UK market for butter and cheese, leading to better raw milk prices and possibly even expansion of the dairy sector. There would certainly be short-term volatility, as the supply chain adjusts, and there would be higher costs for things like labour, feed and fertiliser. Much will also depend on the tariff level actually applied by the UK government to imports in the event of no deal. There was some relief last May when it was revealed that dairy tariffs would not be cut, as had been previously suggested. Similarly for potatoes, the UK remains a net importer, and growers could benefit in some way from a no deal if that ends up pushing up prices. But there are other issues around the prospects for seed potato exports should the UK fail to attain third country status in the event of a no deal Brexit. So will there be a deal? As I mentioned at the start of this talk, our recent webinar on what the future looks like for farming, the consensus there was that some kind of a deal is still very likely. As one speaker put it, I cannot imagine that Boris Johnson would agree to anything which will drive up the cost of food at a time when the economy is still reeling from the effects of COVID, and I'm inclined to agree with that. Furthermore, failure to secure a deal would undermine the government's reputation for competence. The inevitable sight of lorries stacked up on the M26 in Kent and disruption to trade in general would bring the UK government back to the negotiating table fairly quickly in search of a deal that they were pretending they could do without. No deal would also play into the hands of those in the devolved regions of the UK, especially in Scotland, where the SNP would capitalise on the impression of Westminster incompetence to further their quest for independence, and I'm sure that's a risk that Boris Johnson must be keen to avoid. But time is clearly running out. Talks broke up again yesterday in Brussels, with both sides reportedly far apart. It was originally said that a deal would have to be wrapped up by mid-October to allow the Brussels institutions enough time to sign it off, but that has now become mid-November, and the later it gets, the greater chance of a lightweight deal rather than anything more comprehensive. Turning now to future trade deals with the likes of the US, and the perceived wisdom has been that should the UK fail to get a decent deal with the EU, then the political importance of getting something done with America will be even greater. There could be net gains for the whole UK economy, and even sheep producers and cheese producers could benefit from better market access to the US. But for a whole range of other agricultural commodities, it spells danger. And there's no doubt that the powerful US agriculture lobby will be eager to secure full access to UK markets. Of course, we've all been watching with open-mouthed amazement the developments in the US over the past 24 hours. The outcome still hangs in the balance, although things do possibly seem to be into the Biden presidency. If that should come about, then the implications could be significant for the chances of the UK securing a free trade deal with the US. Boris Johnson clearly had a close relationship with Trump, and there was a good chance that they could meet the July deadline needed for fast-track legislation to approve a deal. But Biden is reportedly more interested in forging trade deals with Berlin than London, and his Irish ancestry also mean that he will not want to make it easy for the UK if the UK has done anything as part of its arrangements with the EU that could undermine the Good Friday Agreement. As I said at the start, we're walking on shifting sands, and well, hopefully things may be a little clearer by the weekend. So finally, slide 4 is what does the future look like for UK farming, and how can it survive or even thrive in the face of such challenges? One of the key things that agriculture needs is to become more outward looking. In our recent webinar, renowned economist Sean Rickard pointed out that while UK demand for food is growing at just 0.7% a year, there's a massive emerging global middle class. By 2030, there are expected to be 4 billion people worldwide defined as middle class, and their food consumption, well, that's growing at 5% a year. Just like the UK middle class, who might like to do their shopping at Waitrose or Marks and Spencer's, these people are also concerned with issues like food provenance, food safety, traceability. And these are things that UK producers can produce and deliver with their eyes shut. There are markets out there to be won, and not necessarily at rock bottom prices. Yorkshire farmer George Fell makes similar comments in the latest issue of Farmers Weekly. Rather than obsessing about importing low-quality US beef and chicken, he argues much more effort should be put into developing brand Britain. But without doubt, there will be more competition at home, especially as we seek out trade deals with other countries. The farming sector therefore needs to become more internationally competitive. Yep, there are restrictions on what we can do and on the way that we can operate. GM crops, for example, are banned and are likely to stay that way. And the prospect for being able to inject our beef cattle with estrogen is non-existent. But there's also a great deal of upside in the way that we can improve productivity. A survey a couple of years ago by AHDB showed that the UK is really lagging behind so many countries in terms of productivity growth. For example, the Dutch have increased their outputs to inputs ratio by 3% a year in recent years, compared with less than 1% in the UK. The reasons are manifold, but irrelevant research and development and insufficient skills training are two of the key factors that need addressing. Apparently, a mere 32% of English farmers have any formal training at all. Addressing this will require an industry and a government, but above all, a personal commitment to raise the game. As stated earlier, there will be government grants available under the new domestic policy, but farmers need to become far more proactive when it comes to seeking out their own efficiencies. Part of this can be achieved through greater collaboration. I know it sounds cliched, and the sector's track record is not always so great, although there are some success stories of farmers that have worked together to share equipment or to set up profit share arrangements. But I'm actually thinking more of collaboration along the food supply chain rather than just at the primary producer level. It's surely no coincidence that in the dairy sector, the best milk prices in the league table that we publish each week in Farmers Weekly are those to producers who are aligned to specific retailers. But the same is true in other sectors like beef and horticulture and even cereals, where farmers who work with the food chain to deliver specific products for higher end markets tend to get the best prices. Next, we need to embrace technology. There may be a clash of interests here, with environmentalists and organic farmers advocating a move away from modern agricultural techniques and towards more agroecology, which may be seen as being at odds with any push to more technological solutions, but that's not necessarily true. Our recent webinar heard a lot about sustainable intensification, the use of modern technology, such as new breeding methods, precision farming, and even the use of big data to drive production decisions. And by using the best land more productively, there will be more scope to allow more marginal land to be used for things like tree planting and habitat enrichment. There are likely to be gains and losses in the future. For example, recent UK governments have been quite bullish in seeking to ban certain crop protection products like neonicotinoids and dicot, much to the frustration of commercial growers. But they're very keen on precision farming and have been making warm noises recently about the subject of gene editing, where breaking free from Brussels could soon see this technology employed to the full to deliver crops that are better yielding, more pest or drought tolerant, or even offer nutritional advantages to consumers. Farmers also need to engage with elms, and I can certainly understand why there's a degree of scepticism given the recent track record of agri-environment schemes to be overly complex to get into and heavily audited once you're there. But sooner or later, elms will be the only show in town, and whether farmers end up being paid for specific actions or for delivering particular results, that is where the support is going to be coming from. And finally, it is inevitable that there'll be continued consolidation in the industry as it looks for economies of scale. Sean Rickard has even mooted as many as a third of producers could exit the sector in the next 10 years, although Mr. Rickard does like to make the headlines, it has to be said. In my pre-conference briefing with Peter Lemestre, he explained that in the last 20 years, the number of potato growers in Jersey has dropped from 150 to just 15. Similarly, when I first started working at the NFU in the mid-1980s on the Milk Committee, there were 37,000 dairy farmers in England and Wales, and that figure now stands at 8,000. So consolidation is clearly a long-term trend, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to see it accelerate again in the years ahead. Some farms will inevitably get bigger, while some of the smaller units will survive by diversifying or getting into niche production, but many will, I think, call it a day. There is some cause for optimism, however. An AHDB paper published a couple of years ago showed that whatever scenario they drew up for Brexit, the top 25% of farmers always made a profit. The trick, therefore, will be to get into that top 25%, although clearly that's going to be easier said than done. So thanks very much indeed for your attention, and I'm now happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, first question that I've got here. I just got a bit of an echo going on. One moment, I'm just going to sort that out. Can you hear me okay, Phil?
I can hear you fine, thanks.
Brilliant. So public money for public goods, tiered approach for payment. It's as if UK ministers had read Jersey's rural economy strategy, but will UK farmers be able to embrace this more environmentally biased approach whilst facing Brexit pressures?
I'm pretty optimistic about that. I think initially the whole concept of losing direct payments sort of cast terror. But then I think there is quite a lot of enthusiasm amongst farmers to get involved. There have been various consultations in the last year. The national pilot is scheduled to take place next year, and there's quite a thirst to get involved in that. I think the fact that the current budget is at least enshrined until the end of the current government offers some confidence. So yeah, I think people are keen to get involved and try and make the most of it.
Food security has already been mentioned today. What are the main threats and mechanisms to ensure it, would you say?
There's quite a debate going on between self-sufficiency and food security. And food security also encapsulates access to imports. And there's also a big question around things like carcass balance, that we can consume some things here. We don't produce enough. For example, on the chicken sector, the demand here is very much for white meat. We don't produce enough of that, so we end up importing quite a lot of white meat. But then we have too much of the leg meat and chicken feet and other things which have to be exported. So trying to adopt a little island approach, we can feed ourselves with our own, entirely with our own production, is unrealistic and not really the way to go. Although clearly at 60% self-sufficiency, there's plenty of scope to push that up further. Hopefully post-Brexit, we'll see a lot more effort for things like schools and hospitals and public institutions to be looking to use more domestic production rather than just the cheapest. So yeah, I think there's still plenty to play for.
You mentioned the reduction in farmers. Is that actually a bad thing?
Well, it is if you're a farmer that's going out of business with heavy losses. And I think just generally the structure of the countryside, it needs people in it. It's a working environment, and to just see a mass movement towards prairie-style agriculture with just a handful of people would be a real negative. I think there is plenty of scope for smaller farmers. Often it comes down to looking at ways of getting into niche markets, like I was saying in the talk, looking for ways to generate a premium or sell more direct to consumers. But inevitably, there will be farmers that will be looking for joint ventures, more contract farming, profit share arrangements, to keep going economically.
Can we just finish on some top tips as to how Jersey's farmers can survive and thrive? Because we have heard mainly about the UK.
As I said, I'm no expert on Jersey farming at all. But I think, as I kind of said at the end of the talk about the need to get into the top 25%, and that comes down to things like benchmarking, knowing your costs, looking for ways of containing those costs. People are striving to do that all the time, but maybe just by getting rid of some equipment and sharing equipment, or using contractors as a way of containing costs, or restructuring debt, The other side of the coin is obviously boosting income, which involves targeting premium markets particularly. I think strong branding for Jersey is critical, but I know that that is a large part of what you do with great effect, particularly into the UK, but also into some of these emerging global markets. I think strongly branded, high quality product, which people can trust and enjoy, is part of the solution.
Okay, well, Phil, thank you very much. Some great advice, and it's really been good to have you with us today.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.